At Queen's Park in Toronto, at the home of Ontario's Parliament, there's a plaque on the second floor that acknowledges the valour and sacrifice of black men who served in Canada's military during the First World War.
In honor and memory of the colored men of the No2 Construction Battalion CEF who volunteered their services and lost their lives in the Great War, 1914 to 1919, erected by the colored people of Canada.
Approximately 1,400 black men served in the Canadian military between 1914 and 1918. This is the story of their fight to receive fair treatment and equal opportunities at home and overseas. It contains terms that were commonly used at the time and shows some of the racism faced by black Canadian soldiers. In August 1914, 1 month after the start of the First World War, Prime Minister Sir Robert Borden agreed to Britain's request for Canada to supply 25,000 troops to the war effort. Volunteer recruits were needed for the new Canadian Expeditionary Force. In an unprecedented display of patriotism, tens of thousands of Canadian men rushed to enlist for military service at their local recruiting stations. However, not all of the volunteers were welcomed, and some were rejected because of racist beliefs. Black volunteers were bluntly told that this was a white man's war, so their services were not needed. In the fall of 1915, white volunteers in Halifax, Nova Scotia, which was still a legally segregated city, refused to sign their enlistment papers when they were told that they had to serve with black soldiers. By the end of the year, 200 black applicants had been rejected. In a memo dated April 13, 1916, the Chief of the General Staff at Militia Headquarters, Major General Willoughby Garnons-Gwatkin, wasn't shy about sharing his disparaging opinion of black volunteers.
Nothing is to be gained by blinking facts. The civilized Negro is vain and imitative. In Canada, he's not being impelled to enlist by a high sense of duty. In the trenches, he is not likely to make a good fighter, and the average white man will not associate with him on terms of equality.
Canada was a sanctuary for generations of freedom seekers who had escaped slavery in the United States, and they were fiercely loyal to the country that became their home. Peggy Plitt is a local researcher who specialises in black Canadian history. She says that there's a long tradition of black people serving in the British Canadian military.
Throughout the course of history, black men here in Canada took part in every major conflict that Canada was involved in. I'm thinking, for example, of the American Revolutionary War, the Black Loyalists, the War of 1812. Black men took part in as well. And they also took part in the rebellions of 1837 and 1838. And so black men saw it as their duty to take part in these conflicts, and they were very committed to the war effort.
So when their descendants were told that they didn't have what it took to be good soldiers, they felt they had something to prove. Black community leaders across Canada wrote to militia headquarters and the Governor-General to demand that black Canadians should be allowed to enlist. Arthur Alexander was a schoolteacher and black community leader in North Buxton, Ontario. He was a proud descendant of the Elgin settlement, a community comprised of formerly enslaved black Americans who had sought freedom in what is now Ontario. He wrote to Sir Sam Hughes, Canada's Minister of Militia and Defence.
November 6, 1914. Dear Sir, the colored people of Canada want to know why they are not allowed to enlist in the Canadian militia. I'm informed that several who have applied for enlistment in the Canadian Expeditionary Forces have been refused for no other apparent reason than their color, as they are physically and mentally fit. Thanking you in advance for any information that you can and will give me in regards to this matter. I remain yours respectfully. For King and Country, Arthur Alexander, North Buxton, Ontario.
2 weeks later, he received a brief reply from a low-ranking minion who explained that Ottawa was powerless to prevent local recruiters from rejecting black Canadians. There was no national policy over who could be selected or rejected by recruitment centres. The decision was at the discretion of local commanding officers. Minister Hughes instructed the military to allow black recruits into their ranks, but this was ignored in many parts of the country. Very few black men were accepted for military service, so hundreds of fit and healthy volunteers were turned away. 2 years into the war, casualties were mounting, including amongst Canadian troops. Nevertheless, the continued rejection of black volunteers remained an unresolved issue. To appease the many white recruits who were still refusing to serve with their black counterparts, as well as segregationist commanding officers and the increasingly loud voices of the black community, an all-black Labour battalion was proposed. On July 5, 1916, the Department of Militia and Defence authorised the formation of the No. 2 Construction Battalion. Initially based in Pictou, Nova Scotia, before it moved to Truro, it was the first and only black battalion in Canadian military history. It was assigned to the Canadian Forestry Corps, where it was given shovels, not rifles. Peggy Plett says that the men of the No. 2 Construction Battalion were relegated to different roles than white soldiers.
The same racism that was happening in society was reflected in the army. Apparently, there are people who believe that, Black people are not capable or able to do intellectual work, as in, reading a map or carrying a gun and fight, be part of a regiment.
The British War Office feared that black infantry units might use their training and combat experience against British authorities in the colonies. Although the No. 2 Construction Battalion had an authorised strength of 1,049 officers and soldiers, recruiting that many volunteers proved to be a challenge. A nationwide campaign tapped into the patriotic fervour of the day to improve recruitment.
Coloured men, your king and country need you. Now is the time to show your patriotism and loyalty. Will you heed the call and do your share? Your brothers of the colonies have rallied to the flag and are distinguishing themselves at the front. Here also is your opportunity to be identified in the greatest war of history, where the fate of nations who stand for liberty is at stake. Your fortunes are equally at stake as those of your white brethren. No. 2 Construction Battalion, now being organized all over. The Dominion summons you. Will you serve?
By the end of 1916, the No. 2 had recruited 575 soldiers.
Most of them were Canadian, so they were from Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, but also Ontario. As a matter of fact, there were soldiers that were from places like Guelph and what now is Cambridge. And there were also Black men from the United States who came to Canada to join the No. 2 Construction Battalion. If you look at the station records, surprisingly, you will see that some of these men, they came from the West Indies, or their parents were born in the West Indies. And for me, that was a big surprise when I first discovered that. If you take into consideration that 2% of the current population of Waterloo region comes from the Caribbean, I think that's pretty neat to know that, possibly one of your ancestors was involved.
On December 22nd, they began preparing for service overseas, where their forestry skills were urgently needed. On March 28, 1917, 19 officers and 595 men sailed from Halifax on the SS Southland, arriving in Liverpool 10 days later. Only one officer, Reverend William Andrew White, was black. Of the 7 non-black troops, 2 were in the unit's highest non-commissioned officer positions, Regimental Sergeant Major and Regimental Quartermaster Sergeant. The Canadian Forestry Corps urgently needed support for its operations in the Jura Mountains in southeast France. The No. 2 Construction Battalion arrived on May 21st, 1917.
So as far as I understand, they helped with digging trenches, maintaining trenches. They helped building roads. They took care of the horses. Wood was important, so they were involved in forestry. And overall, these were all support roles, but nevertheless, still important and indispensable roles.
The skilled labour of No. 2 Construction Battalion enabled mills to produce more than twice as much lumber as those that didn't have its support. After the armistice on November 11, 1918, the Canadian Forestry Corps was no longer needed. The No. 2 Construction Battalion began its homeward journey on December 2nd with a layover in the United Kingdom. On January 7, 1919, in Kinmel Park in Wales, a group of black soldiers was attacked after the battalion sergeant, who was also black, tried to arrest a white soldier for insolence. White comrades refused to recognise the black sergeant's authority, despite all of them belonging to the Canadian Expeditionary Force.
Well, unfortunately, they faced the same systemic and anti-black racism that they faced here at home. The fact that the No. 2 Construction Battalion was a segregated unit is racist in itself. They were separated, so not integrated with the white soldiers. They also had to do manual labor. They were not allowed to take part in combat. They had inadequate food and inadequate medical care, and the conditions in the camps were poorer than, compared to the white soldiers. So basically the same challenges that they faced at home were reflected in the No. 2 Construction Battalion.
After returning home, most of the battalion was discharged at the end of February, and it was formally disbanded on September 15th, 1920. The courageous men of No. 2 Construction Battalion had to rely on perseverance and resilience in the face of racism and prejudice just to enlist, let alone serve in uniform. After the war, there was no acknowledgement of what they had endured. It was as if it had never happened. On July 5th, 1920, after lobbying by the black community, the commemorative plaque recognising the No. 2 Construction Battalion's casualties was unveiled at the Ontario Legislature. 29 soldiers had died while serving, mostly from diseases and illnesses. It wasn't until 1992 that the Government of Canada recognised the battalion's creation as a national historic event, and a monument was erected at Pictou, Nova Scotia, the following year. In 2016, Canada Post issued a commemorative stamp for Black History Month that honoured the No. 2. On July 9, 2022, at a ceremony in Truro, Nova Scotia, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and Defence Minister Anita Anand delivered a national apology to members of the No. 2 Construction Battalion and their descendants, acknowledging the overt racism that they had endured. Amongst the guest speakers was Douglas Ruck, Honorary Colonel of the Canadian Armed Forces and co-chair of the Black Battalion Historical Marker Society.
Where do you begin with respect to an apology that has taken 106 years in the making? And that to the descendants, they have waited so long to hear. 3 simple words: we are sorry. It resonated. It's meaningful. It's important. Thank you for saying so. Today we are here to honor and to remember the men of No. 2 Construction Battalion. Because when war broke out in 1914, when Canada became part of that war effort, the men of the battalion were there for us. They were not wanted. They were despised for the audacity of wanting to wear a Canadian uniform. They were denigrated. They were dismissed. They were told this is a white man's war, but they persisted. They were there for us. They were there for all Canadians. And today, all Canadians must thank those men, must stand up and say to them, we are sorry and thank you for what you did on our behalf. So today, I say to you, Prime Minister, I say to you, Minister Anand, I wear this uniform out of respect and the memory and the legacy of the men of the No. 2 Construction Battalion. It's for them that I wear this uniform. It's for them that we're here today. Thank you. Thank you.
Captain George A. Borden served with the Royal Canadian Air Force for 32 years. In the early 1980s, he wrote a poem about the No. 2 Construction Battalion that highlights the racial injustice experienced by black soldiers and the irony of risking their lives for a country that didn't see them as equal. This is the Black Soldier's Lament.
The bugle called, and forth we went, to serve the crown, our backs far bent, and built whate'er that must be done, but never to fire an angry gun. No heroes we know, nay, not one. With deep lament, we did our job, despite the shame our manhood robbed. We built and fixed again, to prove our worth as proud black men, and hasten sure the Kaiser's end. From Scotia Port to Seaford Square, across to France, the conflict there, at Ville-la-Joux and Place Paron, for God and King to right the wrong. the number 2 600 strong. Stripped to the waist and sweated chest, midday's reprieve, much needed rest. We dug and hauled and lifted high from trenches deep towards the sky, non-fighting troops, and yet we die. The peace restored, the battle won. Black sweat and toil had beat the Hun. Black blood was spilled, black bodies maimed. For medals brave, no black was named. Yet proud were we, our pride unshamed. But time will bring forth other wars, then give to us more daring chores, that we might prove our courage strong, preserve the right, repel the wrong, and proud we'll sing the battle song.
Thank you to everyone who contributed to this tribute, including Peggy Plett and Kevin Lloyd-Reid. Black history is Canadian history, lest we forget.